Hey everybody, thanks for coming. We have Dr. Murphy here. He's going to talk in a minute, but first, just a few housekeeping issues. I see a lot of familiar faces, but there's people who haven't been involved with the Institute before. You know, what is the Nassau Institute? It's what we call a libertarian think tank. What does that mean? More freedom, better economy, lower government, lower regulation, so we all can live in relative freedom, relative prosperity. You know, who runs the Institute? There's a small board, committed people, very ethical, very practical people. How is the Institute funded? There's different donors who are concerned, just like yourselves, about the economy, about the Bahamas, where it's going. We've had about 200 donors over the last 15 years. They're all generally Bahamian, generally concerned people. Dr. Murphy brought two of his books that are on sale tonight. One is Politically Incorrect Guide to Capitalism, and one is the Politically Incorrect Guide to the Great Depression, and that's what he's going to talk on tonight. Dr. Murphy will sign it for you. I think he will. So they're $20 a piece. We have limited amounts of each one. Also, we're going to pass around the sign-up sheet. You can put your name, your email, and your PO box, and we'll stay in touch with you with reports. We have an email every week, and we have mailings every so often. Without further ado, Dr. Murphy. I'll read his brief bio. Dr. Murphy has a PhD in economics from New York University. He taught at Hillsdale College before working as an analyst at Laffer Associates. Dr. Murphy is now an economist at the Institute for Energy Research and Senior Fellow in Business and Economic Studies at Pacific Research Institute. He is the author of The Politically Incorrect Guide to Capitalism and the newly released The Politically Incorrect Guide to the Great Depression and the New Deal. Dr. Murphy has published several peer-reviewed articles in economic journals and has written hundreds of pieces for the layperson.
Thanks, Damien. Can everyone hear me all right? Okay. I'm glad that they actually didn't adjust the microphone for Damien, because then I would have felt inadequate coming up here and pointing that in my bald spot. So when I do these talks, I've been doing these a lot with my book coming out, and I go around various places. And of course, the first thing you always say when you get up there is, "Hey, it's great to be here." But this is one of the few times when I can sincerely say, it's great to be here in the Bahamas. This is really nice. I'm very grateful for the invitation to come down here. It's funny, I was talking to my dad, because I have a young son, and I was dropping him off with my parents in Florida before flying down here, and he was just baffled. He said, "Who the heck is going to go to the Bahamas to go hear you talk about economics?" And I had to explain, no, some people actually live in the Bahamas, and it was a very puzzling thing for him. So it's a new experience for us in that respect. So what I'm going to talk about tonight is partially the history of the Great Depression. So that is going to, my book, of course, as you can imagine, focuses on the U.S. experience, and so I'm going to relate that to what happened during the Depression, because the theme of my Depression book is that everything that happened during the late 1920s and then the 30s is being repeated now. And I realize that's a cliche, but it's really true, and as I'll try to explain tonight. And that shouldn't be a good thing. The same policies they put in place back then, thinking, okay, we've got this thing all wrapped up, and no, it led to a decade of stagnation, the worst U.S. performance and U.S. economic performance in its history. That's exactly the sort of policies they're putting in place today. And as I'm sure you all know, that it's not unique to the United States. In terms of the difference between the rhetoric and the ideology and the trends, what they're doing now in Washington, D.C. is probably the most extreme switch relative to, say, 10 years ago. But even so, around the world, all the major governments are moving in that direction. And ironically, because the free market U.S. is doing it, so it must be a good thing, right? Because everyone knows that the U.S. economists are the smartest ones and they know how to run the world. And so, the fact that they're saying we need bigger government to fix things, that's sort of an impetus. It's just to give an idea of how upside down things have become. I was on a radio show, and they were, and I was making some of the points I'll make later on tonight, talking about how what they're doing in Washington is the exact wrong thing, and you don't fix a period of overconsumption and too much credit spending by having the biggest deficits in history. You don't fix overspending by overspending. And making simple points like that, and the radio host said, "Well, gee, how come more people aren't saying this, or anyone saying that to the people in Washington?" And I said, "Well, yeah, former communist countries, they're the ones telling the people in Washington, or the people in China, they're the ones telling the DC politicians. So it's this strange situation we're in where the big intellectuals in the U.S. are the ones pushing for big government, whereas the formerly communist countries, it's some of their politicians and the European politicians telling the U.S. that, wait a minute, we think you're going too quickly. So I'll make some of those points tonight, and then at the end of my formal remarks, I'll try to tie things into the Bahamas and what you can expect to see here based on the sort of trends I'm talking about, and then I'll leave some time open for Q&A if you want to get specific questions and answers there. So before we can really talk about what's the right thing to do in terms of why are things so bad right now and what should the government be doing, or are they doing the right thing, I think we need to step back and try to understand where did this crisis come from. And the same thing, you want to understand the Great Depression. I think before you can start talking about the proper remedies, it's helpful to realize where did it come from. So I don't know exactly what you were taught here in your schools, but certainly in the United States, the standard story for what happened in the Great Depression is that it was the failure of the free market. That during the 1920s we had complete laissez-faire capitalism, unregulated markets, people could do whatever they wanted on Wall Street, banks could make loans, and people could go buy stocks on margin, and there was no limits at all. And of course that just led to this wildcat boom, and then it blew up in everyone's face. And then Herbert Hoover, so the conventional history goes, President Herbert Hoover, who was in office at the time when the stock market crashed, he just sat back and did nothing, because he was this ideological proponent of laissez-faire, and he sat back and did nothing. The economy plummeted, unemployment went up to 25%, and then finally, this official story goes, FDR was elected in 1932, he brought in the New Deal, which was this huge increase in government programs, and that's finally what got the U.S. out of the Depression, right? So that's the official story, and as I point out in my book, that's just every single point in that narrative is wrong. And it's, you don't have to go to obscure websites to get secret information to see that it's wrong. You can just look at the conventional statistics. So the things I refer to in my book, most of it's available online, and most of it comes from U.S. government websites. You can just go look at the budget figures and tax rates and things like that and see that this official story doesn't make sense. But before really getting into what did Hoover do and what did FDR do, I think we should just take a moment and try to understand what actually happened. Why was there this great stock market crash? So to do that, what I believe in is it's called the Austrian business cycle theory, and I know some of you may not have heard that term, so let me just explain what that is. The Austrian School of Economics, that term, it doesn't refer to people studying the GDP of Vienna, it's just a historical term because the people who belong to this school of thought historically came from the country Austria. So that's what the term means. Nowadays, I know many of you are familiar with the work of the Ludwig von Mises Institute in the United States. And so Mises was a prominent Austrian economist in the 20th century. Friedrich Hayek, who won the Nobel Prize in '74, he was also a prominent so-called Austrian economist. They tend to be very free market, and for our purposes tonight, one of their main contributions was their explanation of where business cycles come from. And so that's where my starting off point is here. So to understand that, first we need to realize that in a market economy, prices, they mean something. They communicate information. All right. So the fact that a pound of steak has a higher price than a pound of hamburger, that refers to to real things in the world. It refers to people's preferences. It refers to the cost of productions, things like that, the underlying scarcity. Okay. So if the government comes along and it passes a law and says, oh, no, now steak has to cost the same price as hamburger, that would screw things up. That would cause distortions, because those prices really mean something. Now, the same is true for interest rates. So in the Austrian view, interest rates actually mean something, and specifically, they have to do with coordinating activities now and in the future. So just to give you a real simple example, let's say you've got an economy and it's settled down and everything is all interworking and it's in a stable state, and then people decide, you know what, we have a bunch of kids and we need to send them to college down the road. So what do? They stop going out to eat so much and they start saving more. So among all the other changes that will happen, you'll see that interest rates would tend to fall because people would be saving more and that would push down interest rates. And then at those lower interest rates, that allows people to borrow more easily so businesses can invest more. And the idea is, if everything's all coordinated, what you want to have happen is people's plans for how they're spending and consuming today mesh with things that are going to happen down the road. So if families decide we want to spend less today on going out to eat or going to the movies or buying fancy cars so we can build up money in our savings accounts or in our stock portfolio to pay for the kids' education 20 years from now when they need to go to college, there has to be analogs in the real world that resources that formerly went into making restaurant meals and went into making fancy cars and television sets. Those resources need to get redirected to start building the dormitories and building the facilities and start sending more people to get PhDs so they can be college professors to handle those students down the road. Right? So you can see this is a very stylized example. Obviously, I'm just they don't have that much time to develop it, but you can see the point that in a market economy, it's not just that you need the prices between steak and hamburger today to make sure that resources get channeled to the right places in the current period, but also people's decisions about how they want to spend over time. There's thousands, millions of decisions that all need to be coordinated. And in the Austrian view, the interest rate is one of the prime ways that a market economy makes sure everything all fits together. So when people are very impatient and they want to consume in the present, interest rates tend to be very high. So if you think about it, a high interest rate puts a penalty on distant projects. So if you're an entrepreneur and okay, I could buy resources at certain prices and build a product that won't be available for 10 years, for that kind of enterprise, the interest rate's really significant. So like a housing developer, somebody who's building very long-term things, interest rates are very important. Whereas if you're a hot dog vendor, you just have a cart and you set up on a street corner and you sell hot dogs, the interest rate doesn't really affect your business that much because you get your inputs and you turn them around pretty quickly. Or if you're a hairdresser, you don't really care so much about what's the interest rate or what's the prime rate or the various types of interest rates you might care about. But if you're a home builder or you're in some sort of very long-term industry, then interest rates are very important. Okay, so that's the idea. The interest rates really mean something, and they have to do with coordinating activities over time. Okay, so if that's what interest rates do when they're set by the market, by people's savings and investment decisions, what happens when the Federal Reserve comes in and it pushes down interest rates? And this is what happened in the 1920s, and specifically in 1927, and I discuss this in the book, but very, very quickly, what happened is the Bank of England, the pound sterling was under pressure because during World War I, all the major belligerents except the U.S., they had gone off the gold standard, and they ran the printing presses to pay for the war effort. And so after World War I was over, all the major countries tried to go back to gold because it was very prestigious, and they wanted to reinsure investors around the world. But they went back to the pre-war parity. Okay, so the idea was the Bank of England had printed up a bunch of paper pound sterling, and yet they were trying to get away with going back to the exchange rate before the war, before they printed up all these things. And so what was happening is gold was being drained from the Bank of England's vaults because investors around the world realized that they were trying to cheat and there was too many of these pieces of paper. So they were turning the paper at the official exchange rate and taking the gold out. So the Bank of England knew we're going to run out of gold if we don't do something. And so instead of deflating, sucking some of those pieces of paper out of the economy and destroying them, or changing their exchange rate to something more realistic, instead they had a meeting with Federal Reserve officials, and they said, how about you guys inflate the dollar? Just start printing up more dollars, lower interest rates in the U.S., and that will take the pressure off the pound. And so the Fed said, okay, that sounds like a good idea. And they did that in 1927. And if you look at a chart of the U.S. stock market, that's when it really starts going up. Or from your point of view, that's when it starts going up in 1927. So there was a bubble in U.S. markets that started really in 1927 and started going through the roof. And then that thing finally crashed in 29. So the issue is not to ask, what was it in 1929, October of 1929, that all of a sudden made the U.S. stock market crash? For the Austrian viewpoint, the issue is what was it that pushed up the stock, what caused this bubble to develop, which eventually had to pop, and yeah, it happened to pop in October of 1929, but given that you had this unsustainable bubble, it's going to pop at some point. All right, and you see the same thing for for the housing market. Now, there's all kinds of different factors, and in the Q&A, maybe you want to discuss some of these, but I think a necessary condition for what happened, certainly in the U.S., and I think it also, fueled what happened around the world, is after the dot-com crash. If you remember, late 1990s, all these internet stocks were they had ridiculous valuations. Companies that were formed and never made a dime in profit, they were going public and drawing in millions of dollars. And there was this bubble in internet stocks. And so that finally crashed. And then you had the 9/11 attacks in 2001. And so the U.S. economy was headed for a severe recession in 2001. And Alan Greenspan, who was the chairman of the Fed at the time, he didn't want that. And so he started slashing interest rates very aggressively, started pumping in money that he basically created out of thin air into the credit markets, and then that pumped up the housing sector. All right, and it's actually ironic. It just came to light. There was a 2002 New York Times op-ed by Paul Krugman. I don't know if some of you are familiar with him, and he's a very left-wing Keynesian economist. And it just came to light that in 2002 he was talking about how bad things were. He had this offhand remark where he said, at this point, the only way that Greenspan's going to get us out of this recession is if he replaces the dot-com bubble with a housing bubble, right? So it's very ironic that he said that, because that is what happened. And now, of course, on his blog, Krugman's trying to diffuse that. It's like, I wasn't recommending it. I was just making this positive analysis. But anyway, so the point is that's what happened in the 2000s. And again, I don't know how much of this filters down to you guys in the Bahamas, but at the time, everyone was calling Greenspan the maestro. Right? I'm not exaggerating. There was a book that came out called The Maestro about Alan Greenspan, and he was supposed to be this wizard that, we should have had a recession. It should have been painful, but nothing really bad happened. Instead, housing prices, people were lauding the fact that housing prices were rising, and that was the first recession in U.S. history where housing prices continued to go up throughout, through that recession in the early 2000s. Okay, so from the Austrian point of view, you don't fix the underlying problems. What happens when there's this unsustainable boom is that when the Fed pushes down interest rates, the economy doesn't become richer in reality, right? There's not more tractors and factories. People haven't actually saved more. On the contrary, at lower interest rates, people save less. They go out and start buying plasma screen TVs, or they start buying homes that they think they're going to flip 2 years later, things like that, all right? They go buy fancy cars. So, what happens to an economy is it becomes unsustainable. And again, with the limits of the talk tonight, I can't get into it. I explain it better in the book. But the idea is, if you had an actual true market interest rate, what does it mean to say interest rates are 6%? That's the price at which people's savings match up with how much people want to borrow. And so when the Fed pushes interest rates far below that, just to give you an idea, Greenspan, I think interest rates were around 6%, and he pushed them down to 1%. Okay, so he drastically pushed down what people had to pay to borrow money, and he drastically reduced the reward for savings. And so when you do that, what's going to happen? People are going to save less, and they're going to borrow more. And so if the true market interest rate, before the Fed intervenes, was up at 6%, and that's what sort of matched savings and investment, by pushing it down, what do you have happen? You have people consuming a lot more and saving a lot less, and people are investing more than they're actually saving. All right, so now some people, they hear that and say, well, that doesn't make sense. How could that be physically possible? And again, it's a little bit difficult, the time constraints here, but just to give you the intuition, the idea is that the economy is very complicated, and what you can do is, instead of producing machines that replace the machines that are being worn out in normal production, so your regular maintenance, things that are depreciating over time, replacing them, you can redirect the structure of production to crank out more TVs or to crank out more houses for consumers to buy. And so you can get by for a few years with this false feeling of prosperity, that the whole, all the economic system is geared towards consumption and geared towards durable consumption goods and things like that. But it's not sustainable. You can't just keep doing that indefinitely, because again, it has to screw things up if the government tinkers with the interest rate. And so that's the Austrian view of what happened in the late 1920s and what happened in the mid-2000s, was that the Fed distorted incentives and made people make the wrong investment and consumption decisions. So another way of seeing it is, a lot of American households, and this is also true around the world, now, with the benefit of hindsight, they would say, oh my gosh, I can't believe all these purchases we made We thought, our house price was going up, my stock portfolio was rising at 11% per year, my home was appreciating at double digits, and so from people's paychecks, they weren't saving hardly any of that because they thought on paper they kept getting wealthier because of their investments. When in reality, if they knew that that was a bubble and those things were going to crash, they would have been, out of their paycheck, they would have been saving a lot more. And so that's part of the perversity of what happens during this Fed-induced credit boom. Okay, so that's the Austrian story of what happened. And so in particular, you had things during this recent boom. You had resources flowing into the housing sector. You had too many resources flowing into the financial sector. I'm sure you're all aware of all these exotic derivatives. They had mortgage-backed securities and things like that. That these so-called quants on Wall Street were devising all these products that were supposed to diversify risk and things like that. And you had all this talent, really talented people with PhDs in physics and math coming out, and they were going to Wall Street working for these firms, earning ridiculous amounts of money. Now that we know in retrospect that what they were doing wasn't adding value at all. Okay, so the question now is, okay, given there was this artificial boom period, what needs to happen? And the answer is obvious. Well, you need to allow interest rates to rise back up to the proper level so people can, so those market signals can mean something again, that interest rate can tell you how scarce is capital, or what's the true price of liquidity. That price means something. People need to know that. That helps people arrange their decisions. And you need workers who were employed in the housing sector. They need to go somewhere else. And all these people that were in the financial sector, a lot of them, they need to go somewhere else because it's, the state of the American and the world economy as of 2005, early 2006, that was unsustainable. And so government policies that try to freeze reality and keep the economy in that configuration, they're harmful because the economy, it can't stay like that. And so just trying to, what they're really doing is they're trying to reflate the bubble. All right, so it's perverse that the typical government response, of course, is the exact opposite of what I'm saying. What does the government do? The Federal Reserve, after the crisis set in, and again, this was true back in the Depression and it's true today, they started cutting interest rates. And in fact, in the U.S., they've got interest rates basically down to zero, and that's not even enough for them. Now there's plenty of academics saying, okay, well, the Fed can't push actual interest rates below zero because no one's going to lend $100 to get 95 back next year. And so now, so you would think that, okay, they might have thought, okay, since we've pushed interest rates down to zero and nothing's getting better, maybe we should rethink our strategy. But that's not what they're doing. They're saying, okay, well, the problem is real interest rates, meaning inflation-adjusted interest rates, should be around -5%. But we can't set actual nominal interest rates at -5%. So here's what we'll do. We'll keep actual nominal rates at 0%, and we'll promise people 5% inflation next year. So that in real terms, it's a -5% real interest rate. And so the correct thing is Ben Bernanke should promise people that he's going to flood the market with money next year. Right? And that's the recommendation of people like Paul Krugman from the left, and then people like Greg Mankiw, if you know that name, from the so-called right. So I mean, this wide spectrum of opinion in terms of respectable media opinion, they all agree that what the Fed needs to do is promise to dump more green pieces of paper in the U.S. economy, and that's the way to fix things. All right, so from the perspective of what I've been telling you tonight, that's the exact wrong thing to do. It was low interest rates that got us into this mess. A very sort of glib way to put it is, if the problem that we're in is because Americans overconsumed and the rest of the world overconsumed during the housing boom, the way you fix it is people need to save more now. They need to cut their consumption so to replenish, all the sectors that were starved, as it were, during the boom period. Because again, during the boom, certain sectors expanded, like housing and financial services, at the expense of other ones. Because when Greenspan cut interest rates, the economy didn't really get richer. People thought they were richer. They went out and started spending and buying imports from China and things like that, but they weren't really richer. So something has to give. And the idea is what had to give was the capital structure of the United States and other countries that participated in this boom. And so the way you fix that, again, is people have to cut back on their consumption. They lived above their means for many years, and now the solution is to live below their means. And actually, people around the world are trying to do that. I'm more familiar, of course, with the U.S. figures, but Americans, their savings rate was actually slightly negative for a while there, and now it's back up to, I think it's around 5%. And so that's a good thing. And left to their own devices, so they're doing the right thing. American households know that, okay, oh my gosh, we're much poorer than we thought we were because our house just plummeted, whatever it is, 15, 20%. Our stock portfolio just dropped 40% in about a year, and so they're not going out to eat as much. All sorts of sort of leisure activities. Those sectors are all being hurt very badly because most U.S. households aren't spending as much, and that's the appropriate thing. That's what needs to happen. And that's left to their own devices, the economy would fix itself. But the government, of course, isn't letting that happen. So it's counteracting all that, and more so because the government's now running one of the biggest deficits in U.S. history in terms of the size of the economy. So, it's perverse that the government is counteracting all of the normal reactions that are the correct things to do at the household level. Okay, so let me just try to relate a little bit, to tie this back to the Great Depression again, to see that this is the same sort of thing that happened. So you had this unsustainable credit boom in the late 1920s. The stock market crashes in 29. So again, the conventional history books say that Herbert Hoover did absolutely nothing. He just stood back and wanted the economy to fix itself, but that's not true. What Hoover did, he called in all the big business leaders, and he told them, and he did this right away, right after the stock market crashed, within a few weeks. He calls them in and he says, I want you to keep wage rates at the same level. All right, so I don't want you to cut wage rates because I know, you guys thinking individually, it makes sense that your sales are falling, consumers are scared, they're not spending as much, and your natural inclination would be to start laying people off and cutting their pay. But if you start doing that, it's going to cause this vicious downward cycle. And so don't do that. Just keep your wage rates the same, because the cliche is you have to pay the worker enough to buy back the product. Right? So that was the mantra. And this was unusual. And in the book, I give evidence of this, that Hoover himself in his memoirs, patted himself on the back saying how he had broken ranks with all previous U.S. presidents, that during downturns before 1929, it really was the case that the U.S. federal government basically sat back and did nothing and just let the recession run its course. And so Hoover was thinking, I'm going to be the first one to really fight this thing and to stand up for the working man. Right? He says this in his memoirs. He said it in his speeches at the time. And also you can go to the official statistics to see what happened to wage rates during the 1930s downturn compared to earlier ones. And so it's true that wage rates did not fall very much from 1929 to like 1933. But at the same time, unemployment went up to the highest it's ever been in the United States history. And that's not a coincidence. That's because of Hoover's allegedly compassionate policy. Right? So on the surface of it, it kind of makes sense. And if you talk to someone who hasn't studied economics much, it does seem plausible that, in the middle of a severe recession, the last thing in the world you want is businesses to start laying people off and cutting their pay, because then they can't spend the money on the products and it's just going to spiral downward into oblivion. But what happened in the 1930s is prices in general kept falling. And it's a little bit complicated. It had to do with the fact that people were scared, and so they were taking their money out of the banking system. And there was what's called a fractional reserve banking system. So the idea is if you put $100 in the bank, they didn't just take that and go put it in a vault somewhere with your name on it. They only kept about $10 in cash in the vault, and then they would loan out the $90 to somebody else who wanted to take a loan from the bank and go buy something. And so in terms of the overall money supply, the money that the public had to spend on things, cash and also their checking account balances, if a lot of people get scared and start pulling their money out of the bank, then the overall money supply shrinks because of that fractional reserve nature, right? That if you take out 100 in cash, the bank has to call in loans from other people in order to get the cash to pay you off, if you're following me. Okay, so what happened from 29 to 33 is you had all these bank runs, all these banking panics, and so the overall money supply contracted by about a third, by about 33%. And so because of that, and also because people just in general were scared, they weren't spending as much, prices were falling. They fell about a little over 10% a year for certain periods there. Okay, so you had pretty severe falling prices, but at the same time, because of the president and unions and so forth, wage rates weren't allowed to fall. So if you were a worker and you kept your job during the onset of the Depression, you kept getting richer as time passed, because you kept getting the same paycheck. You got paid the same number every 2 weeks or whatever it was, but when you went to the store, over time, prices kept getting lower and lower. Okay, so that certainly is good from the point of view of the worker who keeps his job, but the perverse outcome, the unintended consequence, was that if a firm goes out of business, lays off its workers, those workers had a much harder time getting hired by somebody else, because as time passed, their actual pay, the pay demands kept getting more and more expensive. From the employer's point of view, their sales kept dropping. How much they made in selling their products kept going down over time because of the shrinking money supply and prices were falling, and yet they had to keep paying the same dollar amount to hire a worker for a given hour, for a given salary. Okay, so you can see that's labor economists studying this period, they pick one thing and say, why was it that unemployment went up to 25% under the Hoover administration? That's the reason they'll give, is that because he had this perverse policy. He thought he was helping, but he wasn't, by saying to businesses, don't cut wage rates. Okay, in contrast, if you go back to, say, the 1920 to 21 depression, which happened in the U.S. following World War I, again, it was a pretty sharp recession. Unemployment went up to about 12% because troops were coming back from World War I. The government cut its budget very severely, and the Federal Reserve raised interest rates because they had had wartime inflation. So it was a pretty severe recession. Unemployment went up to 12%, like I said. But by 2 years later, unemployment was down to under 3%. And of course, the 1920s was called the Roaring '20s. It was a booming decade of prosperity. And so you say, well, how come? And another thing is prices also fell even more sharply during the 1920-21 depression than they did during the Great Depression. And so you say, what's the explanation? How come unemployment was so awful during the Hoover years because of these falling prices, but not during the 2021 depression? And the answer is because during the earlier depression, it was first Woodrow Wilson and then Warren G. Harding were the presidents, and they didn't do anything with wage rates. They didn't call businesses and say, don't cut your wage rates. They let business do what it normally would do to maximize profits and to deal with the situation. And so wages fell even more sharply than prices did for about 18 months there. And so obviously, at the time, it was very painful. It's not fun if you're a worker and your pay gets cut. What the point was, unemployment spiked, and then it fell down, and things got back to normal. But during the Hoover years, that didn't happen because he froze wage rates. Okay, so that's just one example of the sort of perverse things that happened back then. And again, to refute this idea that Herbert Hoover was this laissez-faire guy. In fact, one of the subordinates of Franklin Roosevelt, and this happened years after the fact, he was looking back on the 30s, and he said words to the effect that, of course, we wouldn't have admitted it at the time, but most of what we did under the New Deal was just an elaboration of the things that Hoover did under his administration. And just to give you some examples, Hoover had what's called the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, and that was this big institution that was supposed to bail out banks and other entities that were in trouble because of bad loans they had made during the 1920s. So again, perfectly analogous to what's going on today with the Federal Reserve and others bailing out U.S. financial institutions. All right, so one last thing on the Hoover years to show you, again, this myth that he sat back and did nothing, it was the free market's fault. He ran, at the time, unprecedented peacetime deficits. Right, so especially in the U.S., I'm not sure how much it carries over here in your guys' press treatment, but people say, what Obama needs to do is he needs to spend more, because during the 30s they didn't spend enough, they didn't borrow and spend enough in aggregate, demand fell, and that's what the problem was. Well, Hoover did try to spend. He ran unprecedented deficits. It didn't work. And in fact, FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, in the 32 election, campaigned on a balanced budget, and he told voters that Herbert Hoover was this reckless spender. Okay, so again, the standard story you get, at least in U.S. history textbooks, is completely reversed, because normally you would think that Herbert Hoover was a penny pincher and wasn't willing to spend money to fix the recession, when in fact it was the opposite, and FDR came along and excoriated his wild spending as being reckless. Okay, so let me switch gears now and talk about the current situation, so we can see that if the what's called the Austrian business cycle theory, if that analysis is right, and I try to give more evidence for that in the book, but I think most people intuitively understand that, yeah, it doesn't really make that much sense. If we all sort of agree that what happened during this recent boom was people, for whatever reason, and there's all sorts of explanations, it's not just the Fed, there's Fannie and Freddie Mac, which are institutions in the U.S. that encouraged home ownership for people that weren't really qualified. So you had all these horror stories of people getting mortgages that didn't even have a job. They would just fill out the application and make up a salary and they would get it. And part of the reason you had unscrupulous lenders, because the idea was once the boom was set in motion, lenders thought, I mean, they're not stupid, they understood what was going on, but the idea was they didn't really care because they thought, okay, as long as these homes keep appreciating at double-digit rates, even if this person defaults on the mortgage, so what? We'll kick them out, we'll take over the property, and we'll still be fine because it's, you know, appreciating, it's going to be worth more than the loan. So of course all that blows up in your face when home prices start falling. And part of the intellectual error, you know, what was driving this is that the models that a lot of these organizations use, the credit rating agencies and so forth, they looked at real estate markets and they assumed that, sure, any individual real estate market could change, but that its change wouldn't be correlated with any of the other ones. And so these mortgage-backed securities and these fancy derivative products, what they basically did is you would take bits of mortgages from all over the country. So, you know, thousands of people around the country would take out a loan from a local bank, buy a house, and start making monthly payments. And then, you know, through various intermediaries, people would buy up all those mortgages from around the country and then slice them up and sell them off to different investors. And so the idea was for the things that were rated AAA that were supposed to be very, very safe, the reason these computer models said they were safe is because this individual, you know, entity, it's getting streams of payments from all over the country. And so the idea was that, sure, maybe the Miami real estate market will tank, or maybe, you know, San Francisco will tank, but the whole country's not going to all go down by 10% in the same year. That's impossible. That would never happen. That was what was the assumptions in these models. And of course, that is what happened. And so that's why all these models blew up in their face. All right, so, you know, again, there's all sorts of factors that contribute to this. I don't want to say it was just the Federal Reserve, but the idea is in order to get this boom going in the first place, I think, you know, it really took the fact that the Federal Reserve was pumping in billions of dollars and it was basically creating out of thin air. All right, so the situation, you know, where are we right now? The U.S. situation, I think, is very bleak, and I tell people this, and they look really glum and despondent, and I'm sorry that that's my opinion, but you know, that's what it is. It is what it is. So let me just, you know, very briefly outline why that's the case. So in terms of just the overall spending, the United States right now, the forecasts that they have, you know, the Obama administration came out with its 10-year fiscal plan a few months ago, and then what's called the Congressional Budget Office came out and they sort of vet it, and they, you know, had their own analysts look at it. And incidentally, this is called the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office. They're notorious for being very optimistic about stuff. So when George Bush first came in, they were projecting $1 trillion surplus over the next 8 years, and of course that didn't happen, right? So now, but anyway, this CBO, so who has a record of over forecasting government revenues and under forecasting government expenditures, so erring on the optimistic side. This same group, they're looking at the Obama plans, and they're forecasting that the lowest the federal deficit is going to get over the next 10 years is something like $600 billion. It's going to dip down. That's the lowest, and then, you know, for the rest of the period, it's going to be above that. And there's several years where they think it's going to be above $1 trillion. Okay, so that's just the deficit, how much the government is spending beyond what it takes in taxes. They think there's going to be several years over the next 10-year period that's over $1 trillion. Overall, they think it's going to double the U.S. federal debt as a share of the economy from about 40% to about 82%. Again, just in a period of a decade, doubling, you know, the size of the U.S. federal debt compared to its economy. So that's a pretty, you know, bleak statistic right there. But beyond that, I mean, just I can't express. I mean, I know some of you watch U.S. affairs, but, you know, living there, it's really just how much the Obama administration is trying to do, and it's not just Obama. I mean, the Bush administration did this too, in their waning days. The, you know, allegedly free market George Bush was authorizing, literally taking over some of the banks and things like that. But it's, I mean, since they've been in there, they literally own large portions of banks. I mean, that's fairly unprecedented. But even back just 6 months ago or so, when this what was called TARP, the Troubled Asset Relief Program, was when they had $700 billion in the financial sector. At the time, they wouldn't have dared said, we're going to buy common stock in banks, because people would have said, that's socialism, you can't do that. You can't have the federal government owning banks, that's crazy. So they didn't say that. What they said was the government's going to, first it was going to be, they were just going to buy the troubled assets. That's why it's called TARP, Troubled Asset Relief Program. So there's these mortgage-backed securities and things that were on the books of all these banks, making the banks insolvent. And so the government was going to come in and just buy those things off of the books. And so Henry Paulson, who was the Treasury Secretary under Bush, that was the plan he sold to Congress. He got authorization to do it. And then literally within days, he said, oh no, actually we can't do that. That would be stupid. We're not going to do that. After he got the authority, got $700 billion in his pocket, he decided he was going to do something else with it. And so they made loans to these banks, and plenty of these banks, they weren't voluntary loans. That Paulson called them in, all these big bankers, handed them out folders saying, this is how much the loan we're going to give you. And he said words to the effect that you're not leaving this room until you all agree to this. Okay? And so you had all these big banks taking loans from the government. And then what happened now, once the Obama administration took over, is you had all these controversies about how much the bonuses were. And so Washington was saying, okay, well, we're going to start telling you how much you could pay your executives. And the authority they were citing, they weren't, because the government can't just tell a private business how much to pay your executives. That would be like fascism or socialism or something. You can't do that, right? Oh no, it's because you have TARP money. All right, so they're saying because you have taxpayer funds, we have the authority to dictate your business to you. But of course, many of these banks, they didn't want the funds in the first place. They were forced to take it. And so then you had banks trying to pay these things back. And the government, just now, a few banks are being allowed to repay the loan. Okay, so again, just to give you an idea of how crazy things are, these banks were forced to take money. They want to give it back now because they realize, look at all these rules, you're telling us how we can pay our executives, take the money back. And the government now is saying, okay, we'll let some of you pay the money back. All right, and there's all sorts of speculation about, once the government has that kind of power over you. For example, Wells Fargo Bank a few months ago called these things were called stress tests, where the government was going to run simulations to see how strong various banks were, and the guy running Wells Fargo said that that's asinine. He said the whole process is asinine, this is stupid. And now, lo and behold, Wells Fargo is being, the results of the stress test come out, and Wells Fargo has to go raise more capital, whereas some of these other banks were given a gold star. Right? So there's a lot of speculation among people that the idea is that the more power the government's getting, people, if you criticize the government now, they have so much leeway over you, or so much influence, they can always come up with a way to punish you for criticizing the administration. Okay, but so you got taking over the financial sector. That by itself would have been a big deal. If they had done nothing but that, I would have been pulling what little hair I have left out, warning about look at the socialism that's coming out here. But that's nothing. They did that. They're doing cap and trade. Which I'm running out of time here, so I'll keep this really brief. But in the Q&A, if you want to talk about that, I've done a lot of research on this. But again, they've done it in Europe. Now the U.S. wants to do it. They have what's called the Waxman-Markey bill that's pending, and they want to cut U.S. greenhouse gas emissions by 83% by the year 2050. And I mean that would bring U.S. emissions back to like the level they were in the 1930s. Okay, just to give you an idea of how drastic a cut back that would be. And so again, just this sort of pattern that they're trying to do everything the way they did it back in the 1930s. And so they're trying to take over the energy sector, take over the banking sector. But they're not done. They of course literally own automobile companies now, two of the big three. And you had the President of the United States talking about automobile warranties a couple months ago. I mean, just again, that's crazy. That would have been a joke a few years ago, but now that's standard practice. They own the car companies. You have they're going to take over healthcare now too. They're going to fix healthcare and insure everybody, right? So all these huge sectors of the U.S. economy, they just keep ticking off. And they've how long have they even been in office? They're doing all these things, huge power grab. So if you believe in the free market, these things this has to be bad news, all right? The government can't just take over everything, bring the U.S. very close to outright central planning, and then just assume that, you'll have a little dip in output, but things will be normal. So that's why I'm very pessimistic about the actual economic output from the U.S., at least for the next 10 years. Because again, the last time they've done this, they did things of this magnitude, was the 1930s, and we saw what happened back then. All right, so you got that, but then that's not the extent of it. On top of all that is the Federal Reserve has pumped in just an incredible amount of what's called the monetary base. It gets a little technical. I'll try to simplify, but all right, so when the Federal Reserve, when they engage in what's called open market operations, and this is what central banks around the world do, it's not unique to the Fed. So when the Fed wants to provide liquidity or do things like that, they go into the market and they buy, let's say, $1 million of U.S. bonds from a bond dealer. So they write a check on the Federal Reserve, give it to the bond dealer, and now the Fed puts on its balance sheet $1 million more in bonds. And then that person who sold the bonds has a check now from the Fed for $1 million. They deposit it in their bank account, and ultimately, some bank somewhere where that check ends up settling, now that bank has its account with the Fed go up by $1 million. Okay, so the Fed, when it writes checks, that money's just drawn on thin air. It's not like the Fed has some finite amount of reserves that it draws down to write checks. No, when the Fed writes a check, it could write a check for $2 quadrillion and it would clear because it's the Fed. It creates the money, right? So, so the problem is, so what happened if you go look at these statistics? So some of you may have seen this, but if you look, so let me back up. The monetary base basically refers to the Fed's, the reserves that banks have with the Fed. So it's like a bank's checking account with the Fed, if you will, plus actual cash, green pieces of paper that are in circulation. So if you look at that figure, so I'll do it from your point of view. It was going along like this for decades. The Fed was founded in 1913, and it's down here, and then within the last 8 months or so, it shoots up like that. Like the rate of percent was over 10,000% at an annualized rate. All right, so it was just a huge, in terms of the excess reserves in the system. Another way of putting it is the Federal Reserve doubled its balance sheet over the last year. Okay, so it's just a huge increase. So now so that has a very serious potential for price inflation. And you haven't seen that yet. And it's really complicated, but the reason is those banks are just sitting on that. So all these banks, they have plenty of reserves on deposit with the Fed, and they have the legal ability, if they wanted to, they could start advancing all kinds of loans. And because they have a fractional reserve system, they really only need to keep about, for all the loans a bank has outstanding, it needs to have 10% of that, roughly, either cash in the vault or reserves on deposit with the Fed. And so right now, they have more than 100% backed up in reserves. In other words, the reserves have risen so much, but they've loaned out, they haven't loaned out nearly as much of the increase. And so banks right now have over 100% reserves, when legally they only need to have 10% reserves. So to give you an idea, just a back of the envelope calculation, this was true about 5 months ago. I think the figure's probably still basically the same, that if the banks lent out all the money that they were legally able to do, the stock of dollars held by the public would go up by a factor of 10. Right? I'm not saying 10%, I'm saying a factor of 10. And so that just gives you an idea of the amount of possible inflation that Bernanke has front-loaded into the system, and that may trickle out if things go a certain way. So like I said, the reason you don't see that yet, because it's all bottled up in the banking system. They have these huge reserves, and they're not lending it out. There's a couple reasons why aren't they lending it out. One is just because the environment's so bleak that no banker wants to start advancing new loans when they just got burned for all their excessive lending, and default rates are rising across the board, all sorts of credit instruments. So banks aren't really in a good mood right now to be lending out all kinds of money. So that's one reason. Another thing is the Fed also changed its policy, and it now pays interest on reserves. So if a bank keeps its money in the Fed checking account, if you will, the Fed's paying interest on that, whereas it didn't used to. That's a new thing that they introduced, I think like about 6 or 7 months ago, or actually more like a year ago. Okay, so that's why the thing's in a sort of equilibrium right now. But the problem is, excuse me, that once let's say we get through this recession, and a lot of people are speculating that the worst of this dip right now is over and things will be back to normal for a little bit. Once banks start lending that money out, Greenspan and others across the board have said we're going to need to suck out those reserves from the system, because obviously we can't sit back and let the overall money supply go up by a factor of 10. But the problem is, how does the Fed suck money out of the system? Is they do the opposite of what I just said 5 minutes ago. right now their balance sheet's really big. They need to sell off those assets so that someone writes a check on their bank to the Fed. The Fed gets that check and just rips it up because the account of whoever the bank was that the guy wrote the check on. Okay, so the way the Fed sucks those reserves out so they don't spill out the overall money or economy is it has to sell off its assets. But there's the rub, because the reason it bought up all those assets was to prop up those markets, right? It bought mortgage-backed securities and also bought a bunch of U.S. government debt. And so if the Fed, even if the Fed wants to do the right thing, once you see prices start rising, if it just starts selling mortgage-backed securities, it's going to ruin that market again. And then all those banks that are finally not recovering are going to be insolvent again because it's going to push down the prices. Or if it starts selling off government securities, that's going to lower their price, which means it's going to raise their yield. So right at the time when the U.S. government is borrowing trillions of dollars a year, you're going to have the Fed trying to unload tens of billions or hundreds of billions of dollars of its own U.S. treasuries. So in conjunction with, if other central banks around the world also decide maybe the dollar's not the great place to be right now, and they start unloading it, you could see just dollars across the world all going back to the United States. Okay, so that's, again, I know it sounds bleak, but it's a double whammy that I'm saying. Not only is the actual physical, real economy in trouble because of this huge power grab, but on top of that, the Fed is really doing a great thing to destroy the dollar. If you put it this way, if you had asked me 3 years ago, how can you get stagflation the way there was in the 1970s squared, they're doing a great job. Right? What they're doing right now is what I would have said, yeah, this is the way to do it. You have the government take over all kinds of major sectors and have the Fed just pump in a ridiculous amount of money, and that's what they've done. Okay, so let me very briefly, I'm going long here, just relate this to the Bahamas. So, normally if I were speaking to people that weren't in the United States, I could say, hey, but don't worry, at least, you're not vulnerable to this. And it's true in terms of your actual domestic policies. I was just reading the latest economic report, the fiscal report, the 09-10 fiscal report from Ingram to the Parliament, and it wasn't half bad. And by that I mean that sincerely, that half of the stuff was actually pretty good. In fact, your tax system, I do a lot of work for the state of California, through a think tank, advising them on how to reform their tax code. And I would love it if they adopted what you have here. That's what our reforms would be pushing in this direction. And in fact, the document, his suggested reforms in terms of collapsing tax brackets. So you have right now 23 tax brackets or tariff rates, and collapsing it to eliminate some of the higher ones. I mean, that's all in terms of tax reform. That's a good idea. So a lot of the stuff was good. Of course, some of the stuff was bad, like this idea of expanding unemployment insurance. Why is that bad? Again, because if the problem is during a bust period, so you have this unsustainable boom, when certain sectors are expanding, people are consuming too much. During the bust, the way you fix that is people need to get laid off, and they need to go to other sectors. So, the most prominent example is because the housing and financial sector booms, there's too many workers in those industries right now, and they need to go elsewhere. And so if the government comes along and starts paying them while it's trying to prop up those same industries that are too bloated, all you're doing is perpetuating the problem. So it sounds heartless, and that's a typical economist thing to do, but it really is the case that you're not helping things by paying people to not have a job, which is in a sense what you're doing if you're expanding unemployment insurance. So obviously, I belong to a church, and I give to the poor. And you don't want somebody to starve to death, but when the government comes out and pays people who don't have a job, you're subsidizing unemployment, and that keeps those people from getting reintegrated as quickly as they otherwise would have. Right? So that's just stalling the recovery. That's making the recovery take longer. And to repeat, this mentality behind it, so partly it's relief effort, but also a lot of people think, well, no, we want to get money into the pockets of these people so they can keep spending. Well, that's not the issue. In a market economy, spending's the easy part. It's going to work and producing that's the hard part. So you don't need to worry about propping up spending. The issue is make sure people are producing the right things. Okay, but the other, so again, in terms of your domestic policies, your interest rates haven't been slashed significantly, since the Depression. Whereas again, the Federal Reserve brought interest rates down to 0%, doing the exact wrong thing. So in terms of your domestic policies, they're not great, but they're okay. But the problem, of course, is that your economy is so heavily dependent on the financial sector, which I think is just going to be awful for several years. And you're dependent so much on tourism, a lot of which comes from the United States. So if I'm telling you the U.S. is a basket case right now, that's obviously not going to help you guys all that much. And then the last thing, of course, is that your dollar is right now pegged 1-to-1 to the U.S. dollar. So if it's true, the U.S. dollar eventually inflates. Just to finish that train of thought, what I'm worried is going to happen is that money is eventually going to start trickling out into the economy. U.S. prices are going to start rising at double-digit rates, and the Fed is not going to have the political backbone to do what it needs to do because it will cause so much pain elsewhere, or because it will push up interest rates. Right? So the way the U.S. got out of the double-digit inflation rates of the late 1970s is they pushed up interest rates to above 20%. And it was really awful, and it caused a very severe recession in the early 80s, but that broke the back of inflation. And I don't think they're going to do that this time around. And in fact, the trade-off's worse. In other words, in order to get things under control this time around, interest rates are going to have to go up even higher than that. And I don't think they're going to do that right now. I don't think the political climate is in that mood for that. So I think there's going to be very high U.S. price inflation. So what does that mean here? I guess if I were you, I would you should really start inquiring as to, what are we going to do? Are we going to keep this peg if U.S. inflation rates get too high, if the U.S. dollar depreciates too much? Because to put it intuitively, what would have to happen is Bahamian prices would need to rise. That's the only way. In other words, if the dollar wants to fall against your currency, but your central bank doesn't want to let that happen, they can just start printing up your Bahamian dollars and then getting those in circulation to raise prices here to restore the sort of natural parity. So obviously you don't want that to happen, and so I think the easiest thing to do would be just to de-link, and I'm hoping that your central bank would do that if U.S. prices started rising significantly, that they would realize, okay, the whole point of tying yourself to the dollar is because the dollar is prestigious and it has this sort of reputation as being stable. That's no longer the case, so let's de-link. But again, if you did remain pegged to it, I foresee significant U.S. price inflation. Okay, so why don't I stop there? And I'm sorry for the pessimism, but at least hey, you're in the Bahamas. So.
Okay, we'll take about 10 to 15 minutes of questions, brief questions, and fire away.
Not a lot. I could ask 10 to 15 minutes.
Yeah.
The Bahamas problem is really a Caribbean problem. Today, the Caribbean is the third largest holder of U.S. dollar reserves, only exceeded by Japan and China. It's larger than another bloc called OPEC, much larger than, of course, Germany or Britain. It's about 310 billion approximately?
I think so, yeah.
That's within that range. Given your outlook, which you've just given us for the almighty dollar as a reserve currency, there may not be really many options open to the Bahamas specifically, but to the Caribbean bloc called CARICOM that holds that massive amounts of dollars, the third largest holders in the world. Would you want to comment on that a little bit?
Yeah, so just to repeat the question, he was asking the Caribbean, they hold a large block of dollars, second only to some of the Asian countries, and possibly OPEC. So you're right. So that's the issue. I mean, part of how a country, especially a smaller country, credibly pegs its own currency to the dollar is that it has large reserves, either in actual dollars, but that's sort of inefficient. They usually have U.S. Treasury debt, right? Things that are denominated, so they're getting streams of U.S. dollar payments, and so that's the way you can link to the dollar, and people believe you because even if there's a run on your currency, you can literally exchange it one for one with actual dollars, U.S. dollars. So the problem in delinking, of course, is that what happens to all those, and that's the problem of central banks around the world that are sitting, China in particular, just sitting on hundreds of billions, many hundreds of billions of dollars in treasury debt, and they clearly do not like the position they're in, but it's a difficult situation because if they dumped their holdings, or even if they say the wrong thing at a press conference and cause a run on the dollar, they'll lose, all the money that they have stored up. So it's a very tense situation. I don't have a great solution except because what you see, and part of why I'm so alarmed, is various central bankers around the world are saying things like, well, maybe we should go to a basket of currencies, or maybe we should start putting gold in the mix, or maybe the IMF should have special drawing rights, and we'll start using that as the reserve currency. And people didn't talk like that even a year ago, right? This is very new language, and I think they're sort of they're testing the waters and trying to get people used to the idea so that if and when it does happen, there's not this massive panic. I think they're trying to butter people up or soften them up. So I don't have a great solution for you, except that I think that they should, if possible, discreetly maybe start reducing their reserves, or at least not add to them. So that's what a lot of things other countries are doing too, is they're not adding to the reserves, they're starting to add other things.
Jordan?
Yeah, Jordan.
Another related problem is that the new parity will mean that Bahamas will become more expensive regarding the US, and therefore tourism will suffer. But that's one of the points. The other question I wanted to ask you is, well, what's your prediction of the next bubble then? Because if the policy of the Fed is as you suggest and continues, there's going to be a next bubble.
Right, so the question is, well, he made 2 points. One was, no matter what, you're going to have a drop in U.S. tourism, because even if you de-link from the dollar, the U.S. dollar, U.S. tourists are going to be poor when they come here. The exchange rate goes to 2 to 1, and so you're either way. If the U.S. is bad economically and we're poorer, we can't trade with you as much. You're not going to get, so there's no way getting around that. And his other point was, what's the next bubble? I think there's a bubble right now in U.S. Treasury debt. That I think U.S. bond prices are far above what they should be. It's sort of perverse, and part of this is I'm trying to justify my mistake. In July of 2007, I had an analysis I did for a bank, and I predicted that this was going to be the worst recession in 25 years, and at the time when some people weren't even sure if we were in recession. So that right now that seems obvious, but back then it wasn't so obvious. That was a pretty good call. But I also said there's going to be, the dollar's going to depreciate. And I was wrong. The dollar has appreciated since then because of this. It's this perverse thing. Because of the financial panic, people are rushing into U.S. Treasuries as the safest thing. And so it's ironic that at the same time, when the U.S. is borrowing record amounts, the Fed's printing dollars like crazy, the dollar is strengthening. And so I think that's just a temporary thing. The analogy I use, I don't know if you guys get the cartoon down here, but the Roadrunner cartoon, does anyone know it? And when the villain at the Wile E. Coyote, when he runs off the cliff, and he runs off, and until he looks down, he doesn't fall. But once he looks down, he starts falling. And I kind of think that's the situation investors are in with respect to the U.S. economy. Is everyone kind of knows this is crazy. Look at what the Federal Reserve has done, but since nothing's happened so far, I guess it's okay, and no one wants to be the one to pull the trigger. But I think it's unsustainable.
Sorry, given cap and trade, may alternative energies be also a candidate for bubble?
So the question is, alternative energies are they in a bubble? I think they are, because various government policies are propping up, wind power, solar power, things like that. They're getting all sorts of subsidies. So yeah, I do think that once things really get bleak and the government eventually has to cut back its funding on various things, I think some of those you're going to see will collapse. Yeah.
There's so many different points you drew our attention to very nicely. A bit difficult to know how to focus on some of them. We talked about the possible devaluation of the US currency, yet only this week you got 4 of the major emerging countries, BRIC group, they said they were going to support US Treasury, or because they've got so much US Treasuries, they're going to maintain that. In another segment, you were saying that people, and particularly in America, are now probably being more encouraged to save. But if they're going to save, where do they put their savings? They're not going to go out and buy consumer stuff, you hope not. But you're not going to put it in the bank with a lousy interest rate. So what are you going to do? How are you going to encourage people to save?
Okay, so the question's a good one. What does the average person do to save, if that's the response? So here, let me give the disclaimer. I'm not an official investment advisor, so don't sue me if this blows up in your face. But what I'm doing myself, I tell my parents to do this and others, is one thing is I have a small portion of actual gold and silver coins. So for me in the United States, I have quarters and dimes that were issued before 1962, I think. They actually have silver content. And so the reason I like those is because other Americans will recognize it. I can say, look, it's a quarter, and go Google it and see that since it's from 1955, it actually has this much silver. So that's a bit, I don't want to be giving them some, gold bar that they can take my word for how much it weighs or saying I can go to the grocery store with a gold bar. So that's what I have just as an absolute. I don't have this yet, but my idea is I'm a consultant, and so the idea is what happens when severe inflation hits. If it were just a one-shot thing, so let's assume for the moment it's not just going to keep getting worse and worse until the dollar collapses. But if it's just a few years of, let's say, 20% inflation, the idea is eventually your wages and salaries will rise until you reach the new equilibrium. And so it's just that intermediate period where you're still getting the same paycheck, but the price of milk is rising by 20% a year. That's where you need help. And so if you had a stockpile of precious metals that will zoom up in price, presumably, then you can unload those to sort of get you over the hump. But longer term, I think what you want is things that will yield you an income that will rise with the inflation. So like if you had, for example, I tell people in the United States, if you have low-income apartment units, that presumably even in a bad recession, people still need to live somewhere. So you have really cheap apartment units that you can rent out, and then as prices rise, you can raise your rents. Of course, the problem is maybe the Obama administration is going to put on rent control. So again, it's hard to know what to do, but the idea is to try to spread to get things that will yield you income that's not a fixed money amount that will rise hopefully with prices. Because again, the stock market's risky, since I think all the stuff they're doing is going to wreck the economy. So I don't know if I want to own stocks.
Jeremy?
Sorry, Michael, I understand that your expertise comes from a U.S. perspective. You comment a bit just upon what, say, the UK and the EU, they've been doing very similar things as far as vis-a-vis bailing out the banks. Obviously, they can't create debt the way the U.S. Treasury can. But by the same token, I see that they're somewhat in the same mode. And I just know a lot of people are looking for emerging markets in other places that the developed world is places to invest.
Right. So the question is, what's the status of the UK and Eurozone? I think the UK, again, and I'm not nearly as well informed about them as the United States. I think my general view is that the European Central Bank has actually been fairly. What they've been doing, they've been inflating, but it's nothing compared to what the Federal Reserve has done. And so I think the euro should do well against the dollar, relatively speaking. They both will probably depreciate against gold and silver. In Great Britain, my understanding is that they're really on the edge, and they've bailed out their banking system so much, and that they're just like the British government it doesn't have the resources. It can't, their banks have so much debt and insolvency that they can't bail them out anymore. In other words, whereas the U.S. they still have the resources. It's just foolish. I think in Britain they're actually at the point where they hit a wall. So I think Britain's finances are pretty awful, whereas the European Central Bank has been a lot more responsible.
There's also perhaps some more ships that fall in Eastern Europe as well.
Right, and also I don't know how much this translates into the actual policies, but the German chancellors have been having great. I've been on my blog. I've been quoting her. It's good stuff about her telling the U.S. you guys are nuts. I was like, yes, that's what I've been saying for 2 years.
Yeah, the U.S. government's been buying up just so much of the U.S. economy. They've been doing banking, automobile. What's next for them to buy up? Are they gonna? Is that it? Is that the extent of them? Or
well, like I said, their next thing is healthcare. Right now, they're doing healthcare, and then later they postponed it. But now they have cap and trade, in which they're literally going to take over the energy sector. So and I'm sure they can take on something else too. And once investors start taking their money and putting it somewhere else, maybe the computer industry, maybe they'll bring another antitrust suit against Microsoft or
so
something.
there's no foreseeable end to what this new administration is going to buy up, basically, or?
I'm hoping at some point fortunately, I don't want to leave people completely dazed here. I think most Americans are starting to come to their senses and they're like, wait a minute, you just spent how many trillions of dollars? That it started because what happened is those numbers got so big so quickly that we got desensitized. Just to give you an idea, George Bush, this happened, what was it, like March or April of, had a stimulus tax cut, and that was like $150 billion when he gave a tax cut to everybody. And people were talking about, well, that's kind of expensive, $150 billion, are you sure we can afford that? And now, you know, the Obama stimulus was $787 billion, and that was on top of the $700 billion TARP and so on. So, I mean, these numbers just got so big, they desensitized us. But I think, to answer your question, people are starting to realize, in the longer, I mean, right now, I mean, people love Obama. I mean, not the people in my circles, but, you know, most people. So I think he has this grace period, but, I mean, after a year goes by, he can't keep blaming everything on the Bush administration. So I think at some point people are going to wake up, but I think it's going to take a while.
Dr. Murphy, our debt to GDP here is somewhere around 45% because you don't have the contingent liabilities factored into the GFS deficit and all that. But with the U.S. debt where it is, people used to be concerned about the Russians taking over. Then they were concerned about the Japanese buying everything. A friend was telling me today that if his calculations are correct, the U.S. debt load, that every citizen of the world will be in debt $128,000 with
Wow.
just the U.S. debt load alone. I mean, that's a staggering number.
Yes, it is. So just to repeat that for the people in the back, he's saying, and I don't know that figure, but it sounds plausible, that if you factor in everything, so like the figures I was talking about, saying like the U.S. federal debt will go to 80% of U.S. GDP by 2019 with these figures, but that just refers to explicit government obligations like, you know, U.S. treasuries and things like that. But when you start figuring in all the benefits they've promised to Social Security recipients and Medicare and Medicaid and all these things, I mean, the numbers get astronomical. Was it 120, did you say?
120.
He was saying that right now the actuarial tables and so forth, that the U.S. government's outstanding obligations, their total debt, works out to about $120,000 per person on Earth, not just in the U.S. So, I mean, part of the answer to that is I'm not getting my Social Security checks. That's just not going to happen, right? So you can scratch that up. You don't have to work to pay me my Social Security because I think they're going to eliminate it. Or more realistically, what will happen is the price inflation will rise and they won't increase the benefits that much. So in real terms, you know, I'll be getting a pittance, but technically it'll satisfy the contract.
Dick, then Jeff.
Our government debt in the Bahamas is unquestionably rising to what many people regard as unsupportable level. Up, up, up. Now this debt is being incurred largely a result of economic stimulus programs the government is putting into effect various ways. Now, to many members of the Nassau Institute, economic stimulus by government is absolutely anathema. On the other hand, without some degree of stimulus, there could be serious deflationary aspects in our economy, or for that matter, in the American economy. In your view, I mean, what is the greatest danger? Is it a greater danger in the long term to build up a huge amount of debt, hoping that the economy will turn around and resolve the issue? Or is it the greatest danger to restrict the economic stimulus and just face the risk of serious deflationary and indeed social dislocation?
Okay, so the question is, you know, what's the bigger threat, that pumping in all this money from stimulus pumps things up, and that's bad because it raises debts, but on the other hand, if you sat back and did nothing, would there be deflation? Doesn't that have bad consequences? So that's something I do deal with fairly thoroughly in the Depression book. I think it's largely a myth that deflation is this boogeyman, that it's a bad thing, that I show in the book that, for example, in several large stretches of U.S. history before the Federal Reserve, you had falling prices. You also have it now in the computer industry, that in terms of, you know, the actual price of a laptop might go up year to year, but that's because it's, you know, the features keep getting better. In terms of how much do you pay for a given megabyte of RAM or something like that, I mean, those prices keep falling in certain industries, and that obviously doesn't mean the computer industry is stagnant, or that, you know, that everyone's afraid to buy a computer because they're going to wait for prices to fall. So I think that it's largely not true. that falling prices per se is a bad thing. And in fact, again, I mean, I won't go into the episodes, but you had greater deflation during the 1920-21 depression than you did during the Great Depression. And the reason it was so bad in the Great Depression was, again, because Hoover came in and tried to freeze wage rates. So if the government really did sit back and do nothing, it's true, a lot of prices would have fallen severely, but wages also would have fallen. So, people who had saved and were on fixed incomes, they would have gotten wealthier, and you would have had, the system would have gotten flushed out a lot more quickly. So there would have been a painful adjustment period, but I think we would have been over it by now. Whereas by trying to reflate this bubble, you're just frozen in this state for as long as they're going to keep pumping money in.
Yep.
What is quite curious, when you look at the crash in 1929, 14 months later, the market had recovered 50%. And then all of a sudden, December 10, 1930, the collapse of the third largest bank in New York, the Bank of the United States. And from that time onward, the economic system of the United States totally failed. With the change of government, and the government literally becoming the basis of employment, production, and distribution in the United States. This is exactly what's happening today. We've had this wonderful market recovery. Everyone's excited about it. The recession, the depression, it's over. But what is going to be the turning point? What is going to be that December 10 event that happened? The collapse of the Bank of the United States in New York.
Okay, so just to repeat the question, he said that after the 29 crash, the market fell severely and then actually recovered about 50% through the following year, but then it was December 10th, is that the...
December the 11th was Monday. But
okay.
The 10th is when they, in effect, were not able to open the doors. And
right.
It was in the Bronx, you remember, it was about 2 miles. The people lined up to get their deposits. And it was about 2 weeks before that, manufacturers Hanover, 3 other banks were going to merge. They were not able to merge because the Fed stepped in and would not put the necessary guarantees forth to save that bank. In other words, the Fed had caused this depression, which became the Great Depression. I mean, I'm just offering that within the context of your thinking.
Right. So the Bank of the United States failed the following December 1930, and that's what triggered all these bank runs and bank panics. And so the idea was, in the mid-1930s, or 1930, people thought things were fine, and that's ironic because we're sort of in that lull right now that a lot of people are talking about. Are there green shoots? Is the economy recovering and so forth? Has the market finally hit bottom? And I don't think that it has. And again, that's why I went through all the laundry list of things that the Obama administration, again, following the heels of the Bush administration, is doing. That if you believe in the free market and think that socialism doesn't work, then you can't possibly think that okay, now we've settled down, things will be fine from this point on, because they just socialize so much of the U.S. economy. So, and then the specific question was, what's going to be the trigger to cause the market downturn and to wreck the economy? Well, if I did know that, I wouldn't tell you guys, because that would ruin my own investments. But no, I don't know specifically what it is. My worry, what I think is going to, so first of all, there's plenty of banks right now that are still insolvent, despite what the government, the only reason a lot of these banks
80%?
Are still in business is because on their books, they have mortgage-backed securities and things like that are, their prices being propped up artificially by the Fed's purchase programs. So if the Fed ever stopped that, they would instantly be on paper insolvent again. So you could have that issue. So if the housing market continues, right now it's pumped up a little bit, but I think, it could continue to deteriorate, could drop at any moment. Or if some central banker around the world just says the wrong thing, like there could be a mistranslation of what he said, and it could be, he's saying we're entertaining the idea of a few months down the road maybe switching out of dollars, and they say tomorrow we're selling dollars. That right there could cause something. So it's, again, I think the bubble right now, the big bubble is in U.S. Treasury. So I check my internet every day when I get up just to see, did something major happen around the world to cause interest rates to rise in the U.S.
Let's take one more. Yeah.
Yeah, no, just Michael, obviously there's a little bit of conflict in theory here. I mean, we'll agree that there's a lot of printing, there's a lot of treasuries, they're going to monetize this debt eventually, because Russia and China are going against the Treasury standard, more towards the gold standard, or different forms of holding the reserves. Now, what do you see as maybe a triggering event for the velocity of money to bring about the inflation you're talking about? Because basically all you're saying is, as far as the socialist programs, the economy is still very weak and it's slow, and basically social programs are obviously suppressing the velocity of money, suppressing lending, and suppressing any kind of real economic activity. Is this kind of inflation not a few years off, or at least in some ways in the future?
Okay, so the question is, when's this inflation going to hit? It's hard. I can give you a conditional answer. It's going to hit whenever those reserves that are jacked up in the banking system start getting lent out. Now the question is, okay, well, when will that happen? I'm surprised it didn't happen already. I thought the Obama administration was going to lean on the banks to make loans, because you had talk of that a few months ago when people were saying, "What the heck? We gave you guys $700 billion, and you're just sitting on it. So what's the what do we do that for?" And so I thought they were going to pressure them.
Mostly to improve their own economy.
Right. Right. Exactly. So it's the banks, they're not doing it out of viciousness. They're doing it because they fix their balance sheets and so forth. So let me put it this way: once the inflation starts, it will snowball very quickly, because once other investments start yielding 5 or 6%, the little interest rate that the Fed's paying banks to keep their money with them isn't going to be attractive, and they'll start lending out, because they can charge higher interest rates elsewhere. Because right now, it's in this weird stable equilibrium point, because interest rates are so low, inflation expectations are so low that interest rates are low, and so it makes sense to sit on cash or to keep your reserves in a checking account that pays a very low rate of interest. But if that situation changed for whatever reason, then it would quickly snowball. That you don't want to sit on your cash when there's 10% inflation, but if you think there's going to be 1% inflation, you don't mind sitting on your cash.
Before Ms. Thompson, thanks Dr. Murphy. One thing I forgot to say in the introduction is the Nassau Institute is a non-profit. It's a very small budget, but we do need to rent the hall. We pay Dr. Murphy to fly down, and just you coming is really compensation enough, because the board, myself, value the information getting out. It's not heard by anybody in government anywhere else. So we have a small box in the back. You can give donations. You don't have to. It's not compelling. But if you help us run, we can put more events like this on. Thanks.
My thanks to everybody for coming. We appreciate it, and I know you've heard something tonight. Maybe you haven't thought about it, maybe you have thought about it, but maybe I hope you know more about it now. I'm quite certain you do. And Bob, there are two things that come to my mind as you're speaking, thinking of the Roosevelt administration and now the Obama administration. Roosevelt had his brain trust. Remember those really smart guys who were fixing everything? Well, we've got Larry Sumner and we've got Mr. Geico up there fixing everything. Where is the problem? The problem, I think, is sometimes people think they have the answers and they're just missing. They don't see the forest for the trees. It's not that simple, but there's something missing here when people think they have all the answers. And it's interesting that we have these two comparable situations in what we are now Depression, Recession, and in the Great Depression. But in any case, that's what came to my mind. But anyway, what this is, I found it exceedingly, I hope everybody is going to get a book here and read more about it and discuss it among yourselves, your friends. And I think one thing is we're all a bit very concerned. Well, we're all very concerned. You wouldn't be here tonight if you weren't concerned. But one of the best ways to help allay any fears you might have is to become informed. And there's some kind of relief when you begin to understand what's going on. Now, we have a lot of people in our audience here tonight who are Institute supporters, who do look at the Bahamian economy, and I'm sure you've benefited from Dr. Murphy's talk tonight. And I want to make a little gift to Dr. Murphy from the directors of the Institute, because this is a book on the Bahamas. and Michael Toogood's photos, and our great pleasure to take something back. Could have put a bit of sand in it. But